This one is not. The outfall is in the wrong place, in my opinion, and they have not put enough money into maintenance of it. And if you don't do those things,
Comes back to bite you.
that's right.
Yeah.
And this one was very unfortunate in that it got flooded over the top, but also through the pipe.
Oh, back up.
Yep.
Ooh. How did that happen? That was.
Well, the first place, the pipe is about 3 miles long.
Yeah.
So when the storm surge came in, they couldn't pump against the head of water. And so it just went back up the system.
But don't they have to take that into consideration when they're designing something?
Well, you would think so, but there are a few plants around here that have difficulty pumping against the head of water.
There shouldn't be a check valve or something. Well,
Yeah.
you keep.
New York City has check valves.
Yeah. Or at least stop it from backing up.
Right. You know, they got to get rid of the stuff because it keeps coming in.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, it keeps coming in. That's one of the things when they're talking about the canal here. Because they're talking about putting like 40 condos on the canal. And then they want to pump the sewage uphill and across the street.
No. Most big treatment plants are run by gravity.
Not that way, not pumping it up.
Right.
That could be a disaster.
That's right.
Especially if it's right on the canal.
That's right.
Water's 50 feet away.
And then we have one of our famous power outages.
I remember a number of them. One time, I think it was 11 days without. You know what the worst thing with being out of power?
But
The lack of water.
yes. We
You
were on
can't
a well
flush
for
your
a long
toilet,
time.
you can't wash, you can't do anything without water.
I live down on Stony Brook Harbor, and we have a freshwater stream that runs into it. And when we were still on a well, during storms, I would have to go down there and fill jugs and bring it back to flush the toilet
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah.
So we were lucky because a lot of people didn't have that luxury
Yeah.
of having access to water.
Well, now we have what I guess most people would call city water, and at least you have water
Yeah.
because they have generators to keep that operating. So that's not too bad. Here he comes.
Larry, do you want to wear a microphone?
Huh?
Do you want to wear a microphone or do you want to stand here?
Well, I'll probably wander around.
So I can. Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
You got one to your system. But evidently there's two of you speaking.
Yes.
So that presents a little problem for me.
Which one is this yours or
No, that's yours. That's
Okay.
it from college.
Okay.
This is mine, but this only goes into that cabinet there.
And this doesn't.
In the room.
Yeah.
So
So
he said he's going to
he's
speak
speaking
also.
first. Yeah.
Are you going to just, like, in other words, speak and then stop
Thank
and
you.
let somebody else speak?
Correct.
If that happens, then really all you need with this is just stick it somewhere and put that in your pocket.
Okay.
So if
But you
he
can
wants-
start out with him.
He's going to start?
Yes.
All right, we're going to start. So
Yes.
may I?
Sure.
Do you want to wear two?
And when you do it, squeeze it so you don't tear it.
Hello.
Yeah.
Here's the trick. That's for the recording,
Oh, so this is.
and this is for the system.
Oh no. Oh, I usually yell.
Okay. Oh, and this monster is a pointer
Good.
in the event you want it. and Director of Academic Programs here in the Southampton campus for SoMAS. And welcome to our final lecture of 2013 here in the Southampton campus. And season's greetings as well. I hope some of you were around, I think. I see people around for the windmill lighting, which was exciting. We had Congressman Bishop here, Senator Laval, the provost of the university, Wolfie, the mascot of Stony University, and the marching band that led us all in the revelry. So that was a great time. This is the last lecture 2013, but we will be starting up our lecture series again come spring. Probably the first lecture is traditionally in March, so we take a couple of months off. Hopefully get through the worst of the weather. But we will fire up again for the spring semester, the first Friday in March. If you're new to us, we will have a sign-up sheet outside, so I'd encourage you to sign up so you don't miss out on things when we do have our spring lecture series. Tonight, it's my pleasure to be actually a co-presenter for tonight's seminar along with Dr. Larry Swanson. We're going to talk to you about a new institute that SoMAS has just started in conjunction with the governor's office here in New York State and also as a collaboration with New York University. But it's exciting to have Larry out here. He's a real key player within SoMAS. He's the Associate Dean of our program. He's been with SoMAS since 1987 and has been in that capacity the director of the Waste Management Institute at SoMAS. Before that, he was at NOAA for 27 years, working with NOAA, and before that he did his graduate work, both his master's and PhD at Oregon State in oceanography, and he did his undergraduate work at Lehigh, where he got his BS in civil engineering. But we're both integral players in this new institute we're going to talk to you about tonight. It's very complex. Even we have sometimes trouble understanding all the ins and outs. It's somewhat political because we're dealing with the governor's office. But we're going to give you sort of tonight a taste of what the institute is about, what we hope to achieve, and the overarching goals. So with that, I'll turn it over to Larry, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Chris. This is indeed a very complex institute to run. First of all, it involves two universities, ours and New York University as well. And I'd just like to introduce Bruce Brownowell. Where are you, Bruce? Bruce. And one of the reasons that the institute took off was, I think, largely because of two things. One was Bruce's activity, where he went down and immediately after Sandy began to sample the sediments around the sewage treatment plant in Bay Park, and the other was the work that Charlie Flagg did with regard to documenting the changes in the inlet in Fire Island. So SoMAS and Stony Brook University immediately jumped on the bandwagon of trying to see what environmental changes were taking place. And I think that was extremely instrumental in impressing the governor with what we could do and contribute to this issue of storm preparedness. So we're going to talk about NYS RISE, and that's the Resiliency Institute for Storm Preparedness and Emergencies. And it is a program that was started by the governor. This was his formal announcement, or part of his formal announcement on November 1st. And in that announcement, he just says that the two universities are going to form this consortium and work together on New York's emergency problems. So the objective here is to serve as an applied think tank for research and education on emergency preparedness, and also to act as a clearinghouse on information regarding extreme weather and natural disasters. This is our mission. Too many words to read, but basically we're to coordinate and translate research and for application purposes to apply to the built environment, to serve policymakers and emergency responders by providing comprehensive analyses of climate and storm hazards, and to provide rapid assessment and for investment strategies. So this is the mission for what we call Phase 1. Phase 2, we're just starting to develop, and Phase 2 is going to be revolving much more around risk assessment. And it's going to be risk assessment for specific projects. So, for example, if there was a proposal to rebuild Dune Road, to elevate it to such an elevation, one of our functions would be to provide a risk assessment of that proposal. And then in addition to that, we're supposed to try to provide sort of a blanket way of assessing risk for the totality of projects so that each project doesn't have a separate and individual risk assessment process vis-a-vis another one for another project. Well, we're going to talk about Phase 1, and these are the tasks. Rapid response planning, assessment of cascading dynamics, that is the interdependency of bodies of water, infrastructure, and ecosystems. We're to look at vulnerability and resilience, particularly investment strategies, and we also are to look at storm and environmental risks under climate change. So climate change is very much a theme that goes across all themes and all phases of our institute. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of things with regard to some of these tasks. And the first one is the assessment of cascading dynamics. And in particular, we're going to look at the flooding impacts of wastewater infrastructure. This is a newspaper article from the New York Times, and it talks about the problem that was experienced in Hempstead Bay, where the Bay Park sewage treatment plant broke down on the night of the hurricane, broke down about 10 o'clock. It didn't function for 56 hours. And when it came back online, it came back gradually. First there was just a pumping of raw sewage, and then there was they finally got some primary treatment, then they got a little secondary treatment, and then finally they were able to chlorinate and things like that. But one of the problems that they faced was that they could not pump the sewage to where it was supposed to be discharged. There's about 3 miles space between the plant and where the outfall is. And so because of the damage from the flooding at the plant, what they had to do was they had to pump very close to the north shore of Hempstead Bay, and as a consequence, it caused some very interesting problems and some very serious environmental damage. This is just an example of some of the flooding that took place in the plant. The plant was flooded both from the top, from the storm surge, but it was also flooded from water and sewage backing up into the pipe and back into the plant, because they couldn't pump against the head of water. So I can't imagine what it was like to go into that plant 2 or 3 days after the storm and begin to clean it up. I've spent a lot of time in sewage treatment plants, but fortunately not in this condition. So I want to point out a little bit about this. This is some of Bruce Brownowell's work. The discharge is typically here in Reynolds Channel. The plant is up here, and in the emergency they had to pump out in Mill Creek up in the north end of Hempstead Bay. While I'm on this slide, let me point out some of Bruce's work, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. He's been using quaternary ammonia compounds as a tracer in the sediments of sewage. And quaternary ammonia compounds are found in things like hair care products. These are things that I don't have to pay much attention to. But for those that do use them, you're contaminating our sediments. And he has traced them as a function of distance from the outfall in Bay Park. And the orange represents data that he collected in 2011 and 2012. The blue was after the storm. And one of the things you can see is that immediately around the outfall is, in fact, that there was some dilution or transport of those particles away from the outfall. So maybe in some instances, the storm actually did some beneficial good in getting material away from the outfall or other places in Hempstead Bay. In general, that's probably not the case, though. These are two pictures of sort of mean conditions of salinity down here in Hempstead Bay, and this is the area that we're focusing on, and this is nitrate. And the thing I want to point out to you is that the mean values of nitrate in winter are the highest up here in the north part of what we call West Bay. The outfall is down here, and the salinity is the lowest up in that neck of the woods. So probably this is an indication of the fact that there are numerous sources of nitrogen coming into the system up here, not only from when they have emergency spills at the sewage treatment plant, but also from stream flow and from groundwater. This is a very similar looking diagram, but actually this is the variation of nitrate on the top and salinity on the bottom. And you can see that the variation is greatest up here. Red is the greatest, and up here in the north end. And the greatest variation in salinity is also up here. So this is the freshest, the greatest variation in salinity, and this is the highest concentration with the greatest variation in nitrogen in the area. Now, one of the things that we've been able to do, fortunately, is look at some of the USGS data. This is nitrogen data. This is concentrations of nitrogen as a function of water elevation. And this also is from winter. And the interesting thing about this is that essentially there is no change in nitrogen concentration as a function of tidal height. We first started to look at this as a way of trying to decipher whether or not groundwater was a significant contributor to nitrogen in West Bay. And theoretically, the concentration of nitrogen would have been highest at low water when there was less of a head of water covering the discharge of nitrogen, and it would have been lowest at high water. But we found essentially no significant tidal signal. And this is, I think, very interesting to see in the context of what happened during the storm. So the blue line represents tidal elevation. This is the storm surge here on October 29th. This is nitrogen concentration. And if you look at it, you will see that this is when the treatment plant broke down. They didn't collect the data at the USGS site. But shortly after that, you'll see that the variation in nitrogen began to get quite a bit larger than normal. And the other thing is that you began to see that the highest concentrations of nitrogen actually occurred at low water. And the reason for this, yes?
What does USGS stand for?
I'm sorry, U.S. Geological Survey. U.S. Geological Survey monitors many different types of parameters around the country. They stage the tide, river level, and chemical contamination in streams and estuarine systems. So they're very prominent here in Long Island. So anyway, you can see that we began to get highest concentrations at low water. The other thing that you see is that the variation is quite a bit larger during the breakdown, which took place from roughly late October into December. So what happened here is that after the treatment plant broke down, they could no longer pump against the head of water that occurred when the tide was high. They could only pump on low water. And so that's what you're seeing here. This is when they're pumping out of the outfall in Reynolds Channel in the south part of Hempstead Bay. And here is a picture of a longer time series. Here, this is before the storm. You can see that the variation in nitrogen is considerably less than it was when the plant was broken down from roughly late October into actually into mid-December. And this is after the plant went back online, and you can see that the nitrogen variation went down considerably compared to when the plant was offline. So the point is that this is one of the problems that was created with the storm when the plant broke down. And one of the charges that we have is to look at what the consequences of these kinds of breakdowns actually will be having on the environment. Ultimately, this will feed into a decision probably of what the Bay Park sewage treatment plant is going to do in the future. And there are three options that are being explored. One is to go to tertiary treatment to try to reduce nitrogen. The second is to build an ocean outfall and probably maintain secondary treatment. Or you pump the discharge onto land and try to recharge groundwater. So those things are now being debated. The reason we're interested in nitrogen and some of the work that Chris has done over the years is what are the ecological consequences? Well, Hempstead Bay is an impaired water body as declared by the U.S. EPA and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And in this particular case, the impairment is from nitrogen, and the problem largely is the tremendous growth of alga, or what I call sea lettuce. It's so bad that the alga drifts in what they call down there greenbergs. They're literally hunks of alga that may be 10, 15 feet long, and they may be 2 or 3 feet deep, and they drift in the channel. Eventually, much of it accumulates on Point Lookout. It begins to rot. It creates hydrogen sulfide, and it's created hydrogen sulfide to the extent that it's caused respiratory problems, and it's also turned some of the paint on the houses black. So this is why we're interested in nitrogen, because it helps to stimulate this growth of alga. All right, so next thing I want to just talk about is some of the other activities that we're doing, and here we're looking at vulnerability assessment. And this is some of Bruce Branowell's work. And this is the report of oil spills as a consequence of Hurricane Sandy. And Hurricane Sandy occurred here, and notice this is spike in reported oil spills. So this is about 15 days after the storm actually occurred, and it's sort of interesting because the spills really took place here. And one of the questions that might be asked is, if this was in summer and you were wanting to use the beaches and you wanted to go out in the beaches in this time frame, but the reporting wasn't taking place until half a month later, what are the consequences of that in terms of public health? This is really a dramatic increase in spills. There was something like 4,000 spills reported as a consequence of Sandy, and probably most of them were a result of home heating oil tanks popping off. And I sort of find this interesting because the state insisted that we take our tanks out of the ground a few years ago, about a decade ago, and that we elevate them and have them above ground. And if you live in a coastal area and we have a storm surge now, they just sort of pop off like a cork and create oil spills. This is a map showing where many of these spills occurred on the south shore of Long Island. Here we have Hempstead Bay down here going out to Great South Bay, and then these are some of the spills around Mauritius Inlet and Smith Point. Another thing that we're supposed to be trying to develop is modeling techniques to look at consequences various kinds of things that might occur in a storm. And again, going back to Hempstead Bay, this is a representation of what actually occurred when the Bay Park treatment plant was pumping out in the north end of Hempstead Bay on the high waters. So on low waters, they were able to pump out down here. On high waters, they had to pump out here. And here you can see that the dilution is very poor. The red is poor dilution, the blue is good dilution. And you can see where they had to pump out an emergency situation, there was no dilution at all, and as a consequence, much of the sewage probably resided there for long periods of time and probably accumulating in the sediments. This is another kind of approach. This is residence time of the same body of water. The red represents long residence times. In this case, it's 250 hours, or about 10 tidal cycles. And the blue is 0 to very low numbers of tidal cycles for residence time. So here we have Reynolds Channel. They pump out here ordinarily, but in the emergency, had to pump out here. And you can see that this whole area here is very sluggish and doesn't get much flushing at all. I should point out, this is a very interesting area overall, in that Long Beach is actually several islands glued together. It was glued together about 120 years ago. So the flushing is extremely poor in this artificially dug channel and beach system. So what they did was they dug this beach channel here, took the sand from that, and created the nice beach that we call Long Beach today. The thing that they didn't realize was that they were creating a water body that would not flush well, and then when they put a sewage outfall into the area, that just exacerbated problems. And finally, just want to mention before I turn this over to Chris, is that we've put a lot of effort in looking at some of the marine debris. I only put one town's expenses dealing with debris. This is the town of Babylon, but in that town in 2011, over a year, they collected 11,000 tons. In just 3 months after Sandy, they collected 13,000 tons, and to that town it cost $5.5 million just to get rid of stuff after the storm. And one of the things that was interesting about this storm was how poor we were able to handle the debris issue after the storm. There weren't people to haul stuff. It was very awkward getting trucks. We couldn't get barges to put the material on, and so a lot of it sat around for much too long a time. So that's just give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we're doing with New York Rise, and now I'm going to turn it over to Chris and let him talk a little bit about some of the other aspects. Yes?
Quick question before you turn over. The wastewater treatment plant, when that backed up, was that a combination of two things? Was that because it couldn't pump against the head in addition to suffering infrastructure deficiencies,
Yes.
such as electrical, so they couldn't run pumps, so pumps were destroyed?
The pumps were destroyed.
Okay.
Salt water and pumps don't work well, but because they didn't have the pumps, they couldn't pump the sewage out, and unfortunately they had no mechanism to really stop the sewage from coming in. So the only thing they could do was put it out release valves in Mill Creek.
Is that one of their focal points with this New York Rise, making it a little bit more resilient?
Well, that's what our role in that would be, to try to make recommendations of what they might do. There is a lot of effort going on, particularly in Suffolk County with their sewage treatment plants. I think now they are virtually trying to wall off all their generator systems so that they won't be flooded. And in addition to that, the Bergen Point plant, I think, is actually trying to build walls around, make it flood-proof around much of the whole plant. So there's a lot going on in that kind of thing. The other thing that I think, Suffolk County was very well prepared. might learn some lessons from them. They actually took tanker trucks to have a standby so that they could pump sewage in tanker trucks and store it and then haul it away on another day if their plants broke down. So that was a sort of an emergency thing that they tried to do, and I don't think they had to use it very much, but they were prepared.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about your comments about oil spills.
Uh-huh.
And I'm familiar with the New York State Code and the Uniform Building Code in my previous life when I worked with FEMA, the mitigation directorate. And part of the problem is that the building codes are generally not retroactive. So if people took their tanks out of the ground and put them in the basement, if they're not fastened, when the basement floods, the tanks will lift buoyancy and spill. And then you have this oil spill in the basement, which someone will come along and just pump it out. And that's what is one of the problems. So I think that one of your recommendations should be changes in the code to require that oil companies are not permitted to fill tanks unless the tanks are securely fastened and harnessed to the ground.
Mhm.
The same thing with propane tanks. I had this issue with the town of Southampton, where after the storm we went out on our road, Town Point Road, and there were propane tanks just strewn about as if they had been floating corks. And I mentioned it, they said, well, the code says they have to be fastened. And I said, forget about what the code says. If people replace a tank, a propane company should not be permitted to fill an exterior tank unless the tank is properly secured to the ground. That's one of the things, because if it's not enforced, it doesn't matter what you write in the code.
Okay, so that would be very helpful. Can I, after the meeting, get your name and we can try to follow up? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll pick it up from there. And I'll just mention that, Larry and I are both marine scientists, but of course SoMAS is the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. So we're actually not going to cover the atmospheric side because we're sort of giving a greatest hits to the things that we're involved in. But I do want to just give you a sense that a couple of things that we're not presenting today are the storm surge and actually storm modeling and climate modeling that's going on. So we have literally four Nobel Prize winning atmospheric scientists at SoMAS. And they're involved in our storm surge team, where they're actually modeling how storms like Hurricane Sandy and others affect the storm surge that led to all the flooding that occurred during this event, and specifically trying to understand going forward with climate change what to expect going forward and how things may get even more intense. But to stay on the sewage front, because we're having so much fun talking about that, I just do want to mention one last aspect, because I'm working a little bit on Larry's aspect. I'm just going to mention something that I'm working on, and that's specifically looking at pathogenic bacteria. These are things like fecal coliform, E. coli, and other sorts of bacteria. They're called indicator bacteria, but they are a human health concern because they trend with different types of viruses and bacteria that can be a threat to human health via either the consumption of shellfish or seafood or swimming. And what's interesting from Hurricane Sandy, we'd heard about the failure of the sewage treatment plant, but what I tracked very carefully after Hurricane Sandy was what happened to shellfish bed openings and closings following the storm. Now, immediately following Hurricane Sandy, all shellfishing in New York State was banned for more than 2 weeks, so well into mid-November. And then what was interesting is after they lifted it, and I should say the New York DEC is charged with protecting New York citizens' health from, they're keeping them in good health when it comes to shellfish. So they're charged with making sure that people aren't consuming contaminated shellfish. And I know the people are in charge of this, and what's interesting is they sometimes will close shellfish beds just as a precaution. So the 2 weeks after the storm was a precaution. They said, there's probably all sorts of nasty things in the water, oil, bacteria, let's close down the shellfishing beds. They reopened things in mid-November based on testing. So then they went out and tested everything. And what's very interesting is that even 2 weeks after the storm, they were unable to open, as you can see here, a very large portion of the South Shore bays, all of Great South Bay, Southwestern Bay, and the Western bays. And you could say, oh, well, this must have been the Bay Park sewage treatment plant. But as a reminder, that sewage treatment plant is here. And we know that it's poorly flushed, but when it does flush, it's flushing out of these ocean inlets. and yet we had a very large portion of the south shore of Long Island still closed to shellfishing, and no reported failures of any sewage treatment plants. That persisted until a month later, until November 29th. And then through mid-December, we had the closure throughout South Oyster Bay and the Western Bays continued. And, well, I guess actually it continued through, I feel like I might have missed a slide there, but through March. So 5 months after the storm, they still had all of this area closed. And again, this was not a precaution, but this was based on testing, right? So something failed in a big way for a very long period of time. Now, what's interesting is that the data behind these closures is not publicly available yet. So one of the objectives of New York Rise is that we're actually getting this data from the New York DEC, but there's also monitoring by other agencies, Suffolk County, and other groups. And so we're actually going to be getting that data and putting it together and try to reconstruct exactly what happened, when, and perhaps why. Because what this tells us is that there's a larger wastewater issue beyond the sewage treatment plant here, both in South Oyster Bay, but also all throughout Great South Bay. There's a larger wastewater issue that's at play. It may be other sewage treatment plants, it may be septic tanks, and what we're hopeful is that going through the data, we'll be able to get to the bottom of that and get a sense of, looking at the precise numbers, where the hot spots are for these pathogenic bacteria and what's driving these closures. And in fact, we have an area that's actually even still closed in the town of Hempstead. And this actually indicates, for other sewage treatment plants, ocean outfalls. Larry mentioned that before. I believe this is for the Bergen Point plant. This may be for Cedar Creek plant. But again, that Bay Park plant is discharging here. The idea is to perhaps bring that out there maybe eventually. And I'm sure that would be a recommendation from the Institute. Okay, talking about another objective, and that is specifically what are the impacts of the storms on coastal ecosystems and fisheries. And this is a project that I'm leading up. Ann McElroy is a professor in SoMAS. She's here. She's part of this initiative. And there's a series of other faculty who are also participating. And this is to get a sense of how the storm affected coastal ecosystems, with a big focus in Great South Bay and the breach and the new inlet there. So this just gives you a sense of some of the sorts of organisms that we're looking at. Brad Peterson has a large initiative looking at changes in seagrass beds and how they may have been changed in 2013 following the occurrence of the storm. Jackie Collier and I are looking at plankton communities all across New York, but specifically looking across the South Shore bays from Shinnecock Bay all the way into the Western bays to understand changes in the plankton community potentially associated with the breach. And then Ann McElroy, along with Jackie Collier and Bob Serrato, are involved in the project looking at specifically blue crabs, and specifically what are the blue crabs eating. So they're going to be using molecular tools to get into the guts of the blue crabs and see the effects, or specifically what they're consuming, shellfish, perhaps juvenile fish, but then further with that information to get a better handle on their role in marine food webs. We have many more blue crabs now than we used to have. It's partly due to climate change, but the anticipation is with this new inlet, it's likely going to change their distribution in the South Shore, and they, as they become more abundant, that may have an effect on coastal food webs. I think I'll skip over that and just get right into the breach. So as probably many of you know, during Hurricane Sandy, there were 3 new inlets created on the South Shore of Long Island. There were 2 in Moriches Bay, and there was 1 in Great South Bay. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers came in immediately after the storm and closed the ones in Moriches Bay as part of their policy, but they were unable to do so in Great South Bay because that inlet was out of their jurisdiction, because it was specifically on Fire Island and part of the Fire Island National Seashore, and it was up to the National Park Service to make that decision, and by de facto, they decided to leave it open. And so you can see the picture here. You can see this is what it used to be called. Very interestingly, for those of you who didn't know, this area of Fire Island used to be called Old Inlet, because between 1794 and 1830-something or another, there was actually an inlet there, and it was closed. So since the 1830s, it was called Old Inlet. Well, it's now New Inlet. And it had a very large effect on Great South Bay, particularly this area of Great South Bay. It occurred right here This was the area that actually had the lowest salinity for almost the entire south shore of Long Island, because it had the longest residence time. Here, it was very isolated from the Emergencies Inlet, which is here, the Fire Inlet, which is here. So you can see the nodal point for low salinity was right here. You couldn't find salinity that low anywhere else in the south shore of Long Island because of the many other inlets. But you can see how things change immediately afterwards. So my group started doing cruises within Great South Bay in December, early December of 2012. We've been going out very regularly since then. And this is measuring what the salinity looked like right after that inlet. And you can see in that area that was formerly very low salinity, at least low for this estuary, suddenly had ocean level salinity. And you can see not only there, but also all the way over to the going into Moriches Bay. So it looks like this inlet is very strongly, this new inlet is strongly communicating with the Moriches Inlet and leading to very strong ocean flushing in this region. And we've even seen dynamics since it's opened. So this was the initial opening, and it remained this way through last winter. For those of you who may recall, we had many nor'easters last winter. And in fact, the inlet got even larger through the winter in February and March. But as things calmed down and we entered into late spring and early summer, you can see what the salinity pattern is here. Its reach got a little bit less. So in some cases, particularly on a low tide, you can see you can get lower salinity in the northern part of this area, which is called Bellport Bay, but then the ocean salinity there. But certainly what this tells us is that there's a lot more tidal flushing in this region now than there had been for a very long time, back into the 1800s. And it's had some very observable effects. This is data from Suffolk County, and this is comparing data they collected in last December after the storm compared to the way things looked before. So this is a long-term mean for December total nitrogen in that part of Great South Bay, and you can see with the inlet open, the level has dropped significantly and started to look, as we'd expect, a lot more like the ocean. And of course, as Larry alluded to, nitrogen plays an important role in controlling the growth of algae, in ulva in some cases, algal blooms in other cases. We also saw a significant change in the water clarity in Great South Bay. So this is Secchi disk depth, simply a white disk lowered into the water, and observing when that you can no longer see that disk. And here's in Bellport Bay, again, here's the more than 30-year mean of what the water clarity was in Bellport Bay before the formation of the new inlet, and here's what it looked like in 2013 with the inlet present. So you can see a significant increase in water clarity. And interesting side note or trivia about this, I learned this summer that the state of New York's health department actually permits beaches based on water clarity. That is to say, they have a law on the books that says if the water clarity is less than 4 feet, there really should be no swimming. And it's a safety issue, right? If you jump in the water and you can't see 4 feet, you could hit your head on a rock. If you went under, someone couldn't rescue you. So in theory, if we follow the law of the New York State Health Code, the inlet made Great South Bay swimmable. It was legally not swimmable before, at least on average, and was well above that limit thereafter. And of course, as I mentioned, Brad Peterson's group has been working on seagrass in this particular area, and the anticipation is, with more water clarity, this region that formerly was pretty devoid of eelgrass because there was no light reaching the bottom, that there could be more potential habitat for the expansion of eelgrass beds in this region of Great South Bay. I mentioned nitrogen algal blooms, so just a quick taste on that. Here's a comparison of the levels of chlorophyll, a proxy for algae in Great South Bay. Again, taking the long-term mean, this very nice data set that Suffolk County has generated. This is what things had looked like on average for more than 30 years in Great South Bay. And with the new inlet, this is what it looked like in 2013. Very low levels in eastern Great South Bay as well as in Moriches Bay. Levels that you couldn't find previously in this area. Now, I made a prediction with this new inlet. In fact, I was on record in an editorial in Newsday saying, well, with this new inlet, it's going to be so great for the bay, and it's going to do everything I just said. It's going to give us more water clarity, it's going to reduce nitrogen levels, it's going to reduce algal levels, and we'll have no more brown tides. Well, 3 out of 4. Because there actually was a brown tide bloom in Great South Bay. So I was wrong on that front. This is a picture I actually went up in a plane. It was very exciting with Charlie Flagg. He, in addition to monitoring the breach there, he actually owns a plane, or I guess is a co-owner of a plane. And the reason he can monitor that breach so well is he can fly his own plane right over it. And he has a video camera strapped to the wing, and he literally uses that to get a sense of how the breach is changing. So I went up in the plane with Charlie, and so this is a picture I took. This is Fire Island, the ocean inlet. You can see when the brown tide broke out. This was in early July. But here you get a sense of what the inlet did, right? So here's the brown tide, but here's that ocean water coming in and flushing it out. So in this case, I don't really need to show you much more of the data. You get the idea that the inlet became very important in breaking up and diluting the brown tide. Just to put some numbers to that, here is the peak of the brown tide in the summer. These numbers are simply cells per milliliter. And what you can see is that the bloom had its epicenter in the west with over 1 million cells per milliliter. This is a very high level. This is actually quite a damaging time to have a brown tide as well, because there's a lot of larval shellfish through the water at this time, which are very vulnerable to the brown tide. It is a harmful algae. As you know, you probably know it's responsible for the demise of many important shellfisheries here in Long Island. But you can see, as you get near that inlet to the area just to the east of it, the levels are significantly lower by an order of magnitude or more. This was at the peak. What's interesting is just 2 weeks later, the bloom started to die down, and you can see how quickly it died down at the inlet. So here now we're measuring, looking from Shinnecock Bay all the way into Great South Bay, because the bloom actually wasn't just in Great South Bay, it was throughout the South Shore. And what I'm showing you here is the densities at different locations, and you can see once the bloom started dying down, it got to very low levels very quickly at all the ocean inlets. The one exception was here by the Fire Island inlet. That actually inlet is 1 mile long, so it really doesn't function like the other inlets we have on the South Shore. But again, you can see how quickly we got to very low levels with the presence of that inlet. And I guess I was wrong again, because the brown tide came back even again in the fall. And I could talk about this for a long time. The one upside is in both the occurrences, the blooms were very short-lived. So a lot shorter than we've seen in the past, and that may or may not be a function of the inlet. But we saw a similar pattern in that the bloom was intense in the mid part of Great South Bay, but when you were near the inlets, and you can see what the numbers look like, the brown tide densities were quite low. And in fact, these densities at less than 25,000 or so, 7,000, those are really benign to shellfish, so it has no negative impact at those densities. Okay, so that's a sense of that work unit. One other thing we're doing is, instead of actually going out and monitoring things, is another objective within the Objective 4 of New York Rise is trying to get a sense of all the data that's available to us as New York State residents about our coastal ecosystems. So that is to say, there's all sorts of agencies, as you probably are aware, all over New York State measuring all sorts of things, but the data is everywhere. And if you want to get the data, if you've ever worked with this data, it's difficult to get, and you can just get one piece at a time. So one of the overall goals in this particular task is to get a better handle on all that data and actually to try to bring it all together. We're focusing on 2 types of data sets. One is real-time monitoring, so things like buoys and sensors that are in the water collecting data all the time. And then we're looking at what we're calling ecosystem monitoring. That is, there's many agencies out there, Department of Environmental Protection in the city, Suffolk County, Town of Hempstead, DEC, that are all getting water samples and making measurements on some sort of regular basis. So we're trying to get a better sense of these data sets, and then once we get them together, we're trying to see what we can learn about storm threats and climate change. So again, to give you a taste of what this is about, maybe I'll just jump in. I'm going to first start talking about this continuous monitoring. And so SoMAS, we mentioned Charlie Flagg before, the gentleman with the plane. In addition to having a plane, he's got a whole series of sensors in Great South Bay that are continuously collecting data. And in fact, if you want, you can always find out what's going on in Great South Bay by going to his website. You have to punch in things like GSB, MSRC, PO, and it's probably the first thing that comes after that. But here's the buoy he has in Great South Bay. It's online, and it actually collected data right through Sandy. And he's got many other sensors as well. And he calls this the Great South Bay Observatory. So this is one of the data sets we're dealing with. Another one is from the USGS. They have sensors all over the country. Larry already mentioned that. But here on Long Island and across New York, you can see there's a whole series of sensors making different sorts of measurements. And you can see, you get a sense of things. They're measuring things like temperature, conductivity, which you can get salinity out of, pH, oxygen, turbidity, nitrate, and that's probably water flow, discharge. Also at SoMAS, Tom Wilson is an ocean engineer of sorts, and he runs a site called LI Shore. He has different sorts of buoys in the water. You can see a large aggregation in western part of Long Island. You can see the names of different places. He's measuring things here. Again, a lot of continuous monitoring, some of it live feed, some of it the buoys are just recording and storing the data until it's downloaded. Again, this is the Charlie Flagg's data. I won't harp on it too long because we told the story about the new inlet, but here's the very large change. You can see Hurricane Sandy hits in the 29th, and this is salinity, and you can see it jumps by 6 parts instantaneously with the breach of that inlet in Belport Bay. And you can see the very large variation from the expected. Green is the expected tidal range, and here's what actually happened during Sandy. So that's just to give you a sense of that data. Other data sets, University of Connecticut has data they're collecting. NOAA has a whole series of buoys. They have a whole series of buoys. Actually, it's amazing if you look at the set of buoys they have across the world, really. But in our neck of the woods, you can see the different buoys that they have out. And NOAA's also measuring sea level rise. So they have tidal gauges. For example, here's one at the Battery that they've been measuring the change in sea level rise over the years. You can see here's the rate that they've measured the Battery since they've begun monitoring. So what we're actually trying to do, and I think it's ambitious, but I'm told we can do it, is actually bring all of these disparate data sets together in a singular site. And that is all the data available and downloadable so that anybody who's interested in understanding how water quality is changing across the South Shore of New York or anywhere in New York State can go to a singular site, and it'll be the New York State RISE site, to bring down this data and to observe what's going on. So that's one of the main objectives we're going to have there, and then we're actually going to be what I call interrogating the data to answer some questions. And then also to bring together, as I mentioned, the discrete water sampling approaches. For example, DEP has their Harbor Survey program, happened to be run by one of the alumni of SoMAS. In fact, when he was a grad student, it was called MSRC. He was actually one of in my cohort of graduate students back in the 90s. But you can see he runs this program where they're monitoring all sorts of, Jamaica Bay, New York Harbor, going through the East River around Manhattan. And again, this is data that some of which is live feed, some of which is stored, but for this particular set, we want to get their particular samples that they're collecting. And to give you a sense of that, this is the data they have on their website. There's more than this, but they're measuring things like oxygen, coliform bacteria, enterococcus, these are those pathogenic bacteria I mentioned, and also water clarity. And what's interesting is they do these things because these are all standards for declaring the status of water bodies according to DEC. So we're going to be pulling in that data set as well as data from Suffolk County. For those of you who've never looked at this data, it's actually an amazing data set. Since 1976, they've been collecting data of nearly 30 different parameters with hundreds of monitoring stations. And just to give you a quick sense, here are their stations across the South Shore. Here are their stations on the East End. So it's really a massive data set. They also have sites in the North Shore. And again, we're going to try to pull all this data together. In this case, we're not going to put it all up on the web. But we're going to try to answer 2 specific questions. One, how do coastal storms affect water quality? And we're going to specifically be looking at what happened during Sandy, what happened during Hurricane Irene. And 2, can we pick up the effects of climate change in these data sets that go back to 1976? So talking about the NOAA data, this is sort of an interesting data set here. This is the changes before and after Sandy with regard to suspended matter and chlorophyll. and they're mirror images of each other. That is to say, the chlorophyll levels before the storm were significantly higher than they were afterwards. So the storm had a diluting effect on chlorophyll or algae in these systems, at least in the immediate term. But there was a significant uptick in the amount of suspended matter, as you can imagine, as all the coastal nearshore areas got scoured out by storm surge. Looking into that Suffolk County data set, just to give you a quick taste, we can see the effects of Sandy on that. So this is Suffolk County's monitoring of western Great South Bay, so this is an area away from the inlet, and looking at the levels of ammonium, and we can see a significant increase, more than threefold from before and after Sandy, likely a function of either sewage spills or septic tanks in the area being compromised by the storm. Again, we are looking for a signal with regards to climate change, but interestingly, you can't pick that out if you just look at all the data, for example, a place like Great South Bay. So here's the changes in temperature, and in this time period, for those of you who aren't aware, if you go back and look at global temperatures, you can see a change. That is to say, between about 1980 and today, there's been a quick increase in temperature. So as many of you may know, temperatures have gone up about 1 degree Celsius over the last 100 years. A very large fraction of that, I want to say half of that, has happened since 1980. At least with the Suffolk County data set, you can't necessarily pick that up. But there's probably ways to detrend this data, look at things seasonally, and that likely will give a different story. Okay, and then this is the very last thing I'm going to talk about. Again, I should mention we have 15 different what we call work units in this whole thing, and so we're talking about maybe not even a half a dozen of them. But I wanted to talk about this one just to give you a sense that not everything is in the water, or at least in the marine environment. And this one is just how our transportation infrastructure being affected by coastal storms. And again, specifically with regards to flooding and thinking about some very specific things. In recent storms like Hurricane Irene and Sandy, how is that affecting transportation? Thinking about the 100-year storm when it comes to FEMA, and then thinking about sea level rise, as we know is going to happen over the next 50 years or the next 100 years, and how all those things may be affecting our transportation systems. In the last few weeks, NOAA came up with a very interesting tool to look at sea level rise, and if you want, you could go and look at this yourself. It's very easy to play around with, but NOAA got together with the Army Corps of Engineers and USGS to make a tool specific for New York State, and specifically to understand how sea level rise will change under 4 scenarios. And the scenarios aren't here for some reason, but the scenarios are during storms, during the 100-year storm event, well, I should say during things like Sandy, during the 100-year storm event, and then with regards to sea level rise. So they've modeled out how will sea level rise over the next 50 years and over the next 100 years. So this is showing, this particular model is showing the areas that are expected to be inundated in the next 100 years with sea level rise. And on this tool, there's actually a toggle where you can look at particular areas. So here I'm showing a map of metropolitan New York today, and then looking at, with projected 100-year sea level rise, the regions that are expected to be flooded due to the increase in sea level. And you can see it's a significant area, and also, you know, which leads to the idea that precautions need to be taken.
Does that mean floods all the time? So in other words, it could be underwater all the time, or is that just in a storm?
I think that's all the time, with 100 years of sea level rise. So the idea is to take those sorts of projections, and then the nice thing is that that tool is in GIS. And so what you can then do with that sort of layer in GIS is compare that to what we know about elevation and floodplain maps for other areas like Suffolk County, and specifically identify the regions that may flood, and then think about, as that happens, what sort of transportation regions are most vulnerable. And you can see areas, for example, in Mastic-Shirley are quite vulnerable to flooding. Areas in the vicinity of where we talked about for the Western Bays, and also going towards the Rockaways in Brooklyn and certain train lines that may well be underwater in the future. So just wrapping up, of course, obviously Hurricane Sandy was a terrible disaster. More than 100 people lost their lives in the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area. And so that's the bad news. The good news is that there's it brought to bear a lot of the vulnerabilities of both natural coastal ecosystems, but probably more importantly, the built coastal ecosystems. And the United States government has made a big investment in trying to address that. What we're doing is a very small part, but there's many, many agencies, Army Corps of Engineers, to not just rebuild, but rebuild in a way that is recognizing things like 100 years of sea level rise, and recognizing that certain areas are just probably shouldn't be rebuilt. And again, it's not part of this here, but as many of you may know, there are areas that are being bought back, where they're going into communities and specifically saying, we're going to buy your house from you because this is not a smart place to be living. And so what we're doing is sort of just a fraction of what's totally going on. And again, this is just sort of a summary of the different groups within RISE for Phase 1 and the things that we are hoping to deliver in 2014 to the state. So I don't know if it's any less confusing than it was to start with, but I'm going to wrap it up there. And anybody has any questions for Larry and I'm sure we'd both be happy to take them. So thank you for your attention.
I just want to make a clarifying point. We talked about New York Rise. There's also a program that you should not confuse this with. It's called New York Rising. And New York Rising is actually that portion of the state's effort to try to reimburse people for losses during the storm. And one of the reasons I don't want to have you go away confused is that I just heard a report this week that only 5 or 6 houses have actually people have been reimbursed from New York Rising. So don't confuse the two.
We do not have a checkbook. Yes.
One thing I've always been impressed with in your program is the way you're able to take science and put it into English and transfer it to policy. And so I assume that that's the larger goal of this program. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that in terms of timing and the kinds of recommendations you expect to make. Will they be specific policy things, investment recommendations, legal, zoning changes?
Certainly, recommendations is part of our charge. We've been officially deemed. I never thought I'd be part of it, but we've officially been deemed a think tank. So we're supposed to think, and then come up with recommendations. And I think a big part of it is looking at gaps and vulnerabilities. So, and timing is we need to deliver in the first half of 2014. So it's very, very soon
And
that
this
will
is
be
specifically for the state.
correct. That's
so
right.
hopefully the towns and counties will participate or.
Well, I mean, this would be informing state policy, but the information will be available to anyone, including town policymakers as well. And then of course what the governor's office does with the information, besides with public knowledge, that'll be another question.
So the end time is 2014?
Yes. Well, for we're talking about here what we're calling Phase 1. All of these projects we're supposed to be reporting out on in the first half of 2014. So it's a very tight timetable. It's very complex. We're working with NYU. Larry and I made a trip into downtown Brooklyn, which is a very fun place to try to get in and out of. But that's where our colleagues from NYU are. So we're meeting there. They're coming here. We're meeting with them once a month and trying to make sure that we were able to meet the expectations of the governor's office. Yes, in the back.
There's a group out in Montauk, well, actually, they're international, it's called Blue Water Task Force.
Okay.
And they've been doing sand sampling and scientific sampling up the inshore ocean waters, and their results are very disturbing. I don't know if you've been in touch with them.
I have not. I'm not familiar with that group. I'd be like to learn more about it. Yes.
Is the 100-year sea rise mapping available on the internet? And if so, how would
It is. So I'll just go back to that slide because this is a tool that NOAA made specifically, again, for New York State. So this, you can see the title there, the Sea Level Rise Planning Tool. So if you can put that in, and the very nice thing, I didn't mention this, or I begin to mention, but it's in GIS. So for planners who work, for example, the town of South Haven has a GIS department. So you can pull down their layers and then and this is what we plan on doing, is using this specific tool and overlaying it with other GIS files to really get a sense of the areas that are going to be most vulnerable. Yeah.
The area of Great South Bay that was closed for extended time period because of the alcohol levels, I guess it was. Who's taking that data and following through to find out what the cause of it was?
Well, that's what we're doing. So that's our objective. Say that again?
Not Suffolk County.
Well, I mean, again, it's DEC who's in charge of the shellfish beds there, and they're the keepers of the data. And they're happy to share it. To share, you have to put in a Freedom of Information Act request, which we're doing, and we'll have the data, and we'll get a sense of the temporal and spatial dynamics, and try to better understand what's driving it. Okay, well, many of the people who are here came to all of our lectures, really some of the people, came to all or nearly all of our lectures in 2013, so I really do appreciate the people, the public, who are supporting our efforts here. Appreciate you coming tonight, and I hope we'll see you in 2014. So happy holidays and Happy New Year.
It's a canal.
That's exactly what that is. I don't know why it was slow.
Right, but it'll clear out.
He's in Surprise, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Hey Chris, how's it going?
Good, good to see you.
So if you see the governor, you'll know my name. Scott was all too well because I have a lawsuit sitting on his desk right now regarding the infrastructure which you brought up. Because I was running for trustee right in the middle of the storm. So we were in the courthouse because we saw this coming. And we were trying to wake him up and say, look, and in fact, the reason to be bringing his attention now is that's what's missing from the covered transportation is infrastructure.
It's not, I didn't cover it, but we only covered a third of the task, but there are people doing energy. There's people from NYU and also, I don't have their names, but it is all over North So if you send me an email, I can give you the information of who's responsible.
Oh, great. Because
But that is being considered in conference.
let me share with you. Are you familiar with this group here?
Yeah.
Smart Group?
Yeah.
This is essentially the people who bought off, paid for illegally. I'll find you. I catch them every step of the way.